If you really struggle with that in general, like if I were to ask you, like, tell me areas where you feel like you excel or skills that you have or a gift that you have and you can't answer that, I would actually ask you to think about maybe some challenges you've overcome in your life and like think through what did you have to do to get through that challenge? You know, how did you have to show up? What skills were you able to kind of like showcase in that situation, right? Be it like resilience or whatever it is, and then start to kind of dig into that a little bit more to get into like what are some qualities that you have, because we were talking earlier and I forget what your quote was. Mine is you bring
Yeah.
yourself to the party, right? Like you're gonna those are there, they're probably showing up in
Mm-hmm.
all kinds of instances, and so it's showing up at
Mm-hmm.
work. It's gonna show up if you this is your first job, right? So I think we start there. If they have a little bit more of a context around like accomplishments, or areas where they've had impact, then it's more of a cataloging
Mm-hmm.
exercise, right? And starting to kind of think through what are those and coming up with really good examples, really kind of forming that narrative, the story. I know that there's the STAR technique that a lot of folks like to use, where you know you describe what the situation
Mm-hmm.
was and the task and the action you took and the result. I like to really think through maybe adding the part of the result piece, like what's the real impact that you have? Because the result could be very like
Mm-hmm.
tactical, but impact can have a little bit more of a wider reach, right? Maybe like long term, or even in terms of your relationships with people, like that could be
Yeah.
impact with your stakeholders or your team members, right? And so,
There doesn't have to be a number. Yeah.
absolutely, hopefully you can pair it with both, right? But I think adding that and maybe even closing it out if needed with like, what did you learn
Mm.
out of that experience? You know, what would you do again? What are things you learned you wanted to work on next, right? On your path to self development. So, um, you know, kind of doing a bit of that cataloging and that kind of like thought
Mm-hmm.
process. And then the third tool that you could use that I have done with some of my coaching folks that I've worked with, my clients, is having them reach out to 2 to 3
Mm-hmm.
people, hopefully coworkers. It could be also like friends, and asking them, what are you good at?
Mm.
And like, what's impact that you've had in the relationship or on a
Mm-hmm.
project, right? Like, what, depending on what that relationship is. And also asking them, like, hey, what's an area where like you could develop or you could grow a little bit
Mm-hmm.
more? And being vulnerable enough with yourself to take that feedback in, right? And
Mm.
kind of think through that. I think if you have a little bit of that data and that the story is starting to formulate and that self-awareness, it'll help you when you go into those interviews. And you can also work with a coach. I think, you know, part of my job as a coach half the time is like reflecting back, like you tell me a story and I'm like, I've noticed this hearing
Mm.
that, right? And like starting a conversation around that to help them gain a little bit of that
Yeah, it's
self-awareness.
hard to notice those patterns in ourselves sometimes, right? So just that exercise of whether it's a coach or whether it's a friend or a teammate that you trust, you ask them like, "Hey, man, what do you think I'm really good at?" And then it may be surprising to
Yeah.
hear, or maybe it's not surprising at all, and you just take it for granted because that's just who you are, right?
100%.
um,
Yep. And even like the skill of asking for feedback, that in itself, if you can share that with your interviewer, you know, like these are things that I like to do. I do ask for feedback. This is something I learned by asking this
mm,
person, right? That in itself, I think, is hopefully a really admirable trait that a lot of interviewers are going to want to see from the folks that they're thinking of hiring.